Dear students, welcome to the class. Today we'll discuss metaphysical poetry. Metaphysical poetry is a group of poems that share common characteristics. They are all highly intellectualized, use rather strange imagery, use frequent paradox, and contain extremely complicated thought. English metaphysical poetry is the richest and most widely ranging in the language. When the style was most vigorous in the 17th century, it brought forth the best erotic poetry and the best devotional poetry, as well as the finest lyrics, satires, pastorals, and visionary meditations of that era, perhaps the best of any era. The term metaphysical. According to Grierson, metaphysical poetry, in the full sense of the term, is a poetry which has been inspired by a philosophical conception of the universe and of the role assigned to the human spirit in the great drama of existence. In this sense, Dante's Divine Commedia, Lucretius' De Rerum Natura, and Goethe's Faust are metaphysical poems. So are Milton's Paradise Lost, Pope's Essay on Men, and Tennyson's In Memoriam. If the expression of philosophical or theological ideas in poetry can enable a poet to be called metaphysical, Milton and Dante can be described metaphysical poets with far more appropriateness than John Donne or any of his followers. The poetry under scrutiny is not metaphysics in this sense. In fact, the term metaphysical is almost a misnomer here. In his Life of Cowley, 1779, Johnson stated that about the beginning of the 17th century, there appeared a race of writers that may be termed the metaphysical poets. In his critique, Johnson stressed the violent yoking of discordant ideas and images and the straining after novelty, particularity, intellectual subtlety, and recondite learning, though he found some compensating virtues. Johnson's criticism may look sane, but then we and that he has focused his attention upon the extravagances of the metaphysical poets and has missed the essentials of the metaphysical genius. Instead of defining them by their virtues, Johnson defined them by their faults. Modern critical opinion does not wholly endorse Johnson's condemnation of these poets. Undoubtedly, a term was needed to describe the poetry of Donne and his followers from the beginning. Critics put forward a few possibilities. Metaphysical was not the only one. Strong line was the term used by the contemporaries of the poets in question, and Helen Gardiner adopts it. Grierson puts forward fantastic as a possibility. The term metaphysical, however unsatisfactory it may be, has come to stay and will hardly be replaced, for questions of literary nomenclature are seldom resolved to everyone's satisfaction. What does metaphysical mean? The word meta means after, so the literal translation of metaphysical is after the physical. Basically, metaphysics deals with questions that can't be explained by science. It questions the nature of reality in a philosophical way. Here are some common metaphysical questions. Does God exist? Is there a difference between the way things appear to us and the way they really are? Essentially, what is the difference between reality and perception? Is everything that happens already predetermined? If so, then is free choice non existent? Is consciousness limited to the brain? Metaphysics can cover a broad range of topics from religious to consciousness. However, all the questions about metaphysics ponder the nature of reality. And of course, there is no one correct answer to any of these questions. Metaphysics is about exploration and philosophy, not about science and math. The group of metaphysical poets that we mentioned earlier is obviously not the only poets or philosophers or writers that deal with metaphysical questions. There are other more specific characteristics that prompted Johnson to place the 17th century poets together. Perhaps the most common characteristic is that metaphysical poetry contained large doses of wit. In fact, although the poets were examining serious questions about the existence of God or whether a human could possibly perceive the world. The poets were sure to ponder those questions with humor. Metaphysical poetry also sought to shock the reader and wake him or her up from his or her normal existence in order to question the unquestionable. The poetry often mixed ordinary speech with paradoxes and puns. The results were strange, comparing unlikely things such as lovers to a compass or the soul to a drop of dew. These weird comparisons were called conceits. Metaphysical poetry also explored a few common themes. They all had a religious sentiment. In addition, many of the poems explored the theme of carpe diem, that is, seize of the day, and investigated the humanity of life. One great way to analyze metaphysical poetry is to consider how the poems are about both thought and feeling. Think about it. How could you possibly write a poem about the existence of God if you didn't have some emotional reaction to such an enormous life altering questions? Metaphysical poetry investigates the relation between rational, logical arguments on the one hand and intuition or mysticism on the other, often depicted with sensuous detail. Metaphysical poetry is considered highly ambiguous due to high intellect and knowledge of metaphysical poems. Thank you.